You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm sitting here with Dara Massicot and Michael Kofman of the Carnegie Endowment, and we're here to talk about the war between Russia and Ukraine. Thank you both for joining me again.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
So let's walk through the situation on the front. What's the state of play?
So maybe I'll start off and just describe it as we are still in an offensive period in October, but as best I can tell, we have Russian forces continuing to try to advance, focusing partly on the same axis in Donetsk around Pokrovsk-Dobropilya, secondary axis trying to push into Dnipro Oblast from Donetsk, the southwestern Donetsk, a lot of fighting taking place there, and also in and around the northern part of Liman and Kupiansk around the Oskil River, which is a secondary front, but it's important because they continue to try to advance in an effort to operationally envelop the region of Donetsk. Now, they've not made considerable progress towards that goal, but the fighting continues. Some fighting continues around north of Pokrovsk and Dobropilya as well. Russian forces redeployed a lot of naval infantry off the Sumy axis. Ukraine also redeployed its air assault brigades, and they've sort of all reconvened in some respects in Donetsk, and some have gone to Zaporizhia. And secondarily, we have the respective strike campaigns against critical infrastructure. Ukraine has continued with expanded strike campaign against Russian fuel refineries, parts of Russia's energy export infrastructure. It's much better resourced and better organized compared to the campaign in 2024, and is showing some results. The Russian military is also conducting a substantially expanded strike campaign. We've discussed it this year. And I think, as anticipated, previously discussed on the podcast, they have now switched, as it's gotten colder in October, from focusing on Ukraine's defense industry to energy infrastructure. This year, the issue is less that they are targeting power generation and power grid, and more that they are targeting gas production and gas resource. And the most recent strikes in October have been quite damaging towards Ukraine's gas production.
I would say there might be also a bit of a retaliation aspect to that. I think the Ukrainians have said that 60% of their gas industry is now damaged in the aftermath of their campaign against the Russian oil and gas infrastructure.
And this is something that Ukraine has been doing deliberately to impose what they hoped would be asymmetric costs on Russia's oil and gas industry. It's not just become more widespread, but they've also been trying to take out parts of, from what I understand, energy facilities that are harder for Russia to replace, certain parts of power plants and facilities, harder for them to replace through their trade partners in China and elsewhere, manufacture domestically. Do you think it's worth it for Ukraine to continue doing this if they're getting this response from Russia, or would Russia be attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure anyway, because they have in the past, of course?
So I think it's worth it. I think Russia would be striking Ukraine anyway. I think that
we also had this short-lived energy infrastructure truce of sorts, which didn't really actually exist, except maybe it was announced. And
maybe a few days.
As far as I can tell, it didn't really exist. It's something the Trump administration claimed that they negotiated, but like many other things that they've claimed they've negotiated, they didn't necessarily materialize. But as best I can tell, yeah, for Ukraine from a cost imposition standpoint, it makes sense, right? What other strategies can Ukraine pursue? This is now transitioned from a war that on the front lines characterized by positional fighting and attrition to principally a war of exhaustion, right? And if you see it from this point of view, at least that's my perspective, I think you see that these campaigns are only going to expand. And both sides have invested very heavily in long-range strike capabilities to enable these campaigns.
And I would say there's a few compounding issues going on in Russia about this. We can see the results of shortages going on for your average consumer in multiple regions. There's long lines for fuels for cars. There's blackouts sometimes from Ukrainian drone strikes in various cities near the frontline regions. This is also occurring in the context where Russia has not really made a lot of progress in Donetsk. So when you start to have so many problems in the day-to-day life of an average Russian citizen, and they can also look out and see, okay, you haven't even been able to close this one area that you've been trying to for the last year and a half. What is your next move? What's the play here? And the Kremlin doesn't really have a next play.
Putin, of course, is talking a big game, bragging about how much territory they've taken from Ukraine this year, which, depending on who you believe, is probably somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 kilometers. There's different estimates based on what Putin claims and Ukraine claims and the Institute for the Study of War claims. But, of course, this is not really a war measured in territory lost or gained, but in capacity to stay in the fight. What do you think we will be likely to see as Russia's offensive peters out and winter approaches?
So first, on Russian official claim, I think they're claiming about 5,000 square kilometers gained. I think a fair number is probably around 3K, a bit over. That is objectively probably about double the rate of gain they've had year to date compared to last year. But these are just statistics. If we look at the battle space, they weren't successful in making the gains they wanted in 2025 along the key axis of advance that they prioritized. And they've had very few successes other than displacing Ukrainian forces out of Kursk. Compared with 2024, in 2024, Russian forces advanced at a fairly accelerated rate after the Battle of Dievka toward Pokrovsk and made many of their gains from August through November of 2024. This year, they've made in territory more gains, but spread across much of the front line, and many of them, for lack of a better word, in areas that I wouldn't call operationally all that significant, bringing them closer to their goals. And they made them at a fairly high cost. The casualty rate per square kilometers this year was quite high, so high that it's forced the Russian military to focus most of their recruitment on replacing losses as opposed to expanding the force. With respect to how do we evaluate the overall campaign, to me, at the end of the day, look, yes, we know Russian minimal objectives focus on taking Donetsk, but the war is not really decided by who controls Donetsk or who controls the city of Pokrovsk or who controls the next 20 kilometers or any of this. The question kind of being decided is, what is more sustainable, Russian offensive efforts or Ukraine's defense? And the results so far in 2025, the year's not over, I think, are that Ukraine was still able to maintain a defense and hold Russia to incremental gains, despite the exacerbated issues with manpower, which are very significant. And everybody talks about them in Ukraine, on the front line and off the front line. And despite the challenges they have with mobilization and AWOL issues, that Ukraine is able to sustain defense into 2026. Although I'm not eliding these issues either. I think they're significant. In that the Russian offensive effort is very cost inefficient and hasn't really achieved the results they wanted this year, even though statistically on paper they can show maybe more square kilometers gained than before. Lara, maybe you want to jump in a bit what to expect around the winter, but I typically expect a stabilization like last year because terrain cover disappearing, lack of air support, and other things that come in with weather conditions will slow things down from my point of view. And
both sides are changing the tactics that they're using. The Russians, of course, have been demechanizing for a while as a result of the drone-saturated environment and not really being able to gather a company or anything close to a battalion before they're spotted and attacked with artillery and other precision strike and FPV drones. So the Russians are using a combination of foot soldiers and motorcycles. Sometimes there's horses involved. I mean, this is a strategy that they have come up with to try to go around their most challenging operational problem, which is not being able to mass before being targeted. And so that's why we're seeing the casualties the way that we are seeing them on the Russian side. The Ukrainians have also started to use this approach when they're trying to remove Russians from areas. So they're also starting to use motorcycles and small infantry teams as well to try to get behind Russian salients or get through Russian salients and slice them up. So we're really seeing a change in how both sides are trying to tackle this problem. And I think it gets to the point that the front line, the line of contact, 15 kilometers on either side is such a no-go zone for things that move and things that are visible that they have to do this. And that's why we don't see a large change at this point in terms of territorial control.
How do we see Europe reacting to these shifts in the war? It seems like, based off our earlier conversation before we started recording, there's a lot of optimism in Europe. Do you feel like that's misplaced? And also, where are you hearing about this optimism? Are these in closed conversations or conferences or public statements?
We found throughout this war that the tenor never seems to stay in the middle of it's bad, but it could be worse. That's a hard story to tell, whether it's a media story or whether it's a conclusion in a piece or a tenor of a conference. So we see these cycles, whether it's in officialdom or think tanks or just the debate, that cycle between gloom, it's great, gloom, it's great. And we're on this like seesaw where the situation on the ground, I think, does not warrant such optimism. I mean, the strikes that Ukraine is inflicting on Russia are meaningful, but Russia has just really hurt Ukraine in the last week with respect to its gas industry. So it's not good for Ukraine. So Mike, what do you think?
So, yeah, Dara, as you mentioned, we've basically been stuck in the pendulum swing from gloom and doom, it's all over, to we're back. And most recently, we've had a kind of relief rally, a sign of relief over a couple issues that I think is warranted. First, the Trump administration is not wholesale abandoning Ukraine. Deals have been made to how to sustain Ukraine's military effort, and things are looking a lot better now coming out of the summer than they were before. That's fair. Second, that Ukraine has fared better on the battlefield than the way things were looking in spring and over the course of much of the summer. They've counterattacked in Dobropulia, although this fighting continues, and I do suspect that in the coming months, Russian forces will still make progress there. But nonetheless, none of the worst-case scenarios have come to pass, which was the case last year too, right? So despite all the strain, Ukrainian military have managed to hold Russia along the key axis of advance. And so things are looking better, objectively better, than they were some months ago.
Especially politically.
And that's what people often react to. However, on top of that, we have Russian economic stagnation, Ukraine strikes against Russian refineries and energy infrastructure, and there's this belief that now, to some extent, the tables of the war have really turned. I'm not as sure about that. I think it is clear that Russia's military effort has probably reached diminishing returns some time ago, but that's not necessarily going to affect Putin's political judgment and reasoning on this. Second, I think it's clear now that we're probably going to have this war at least for another 8 to 12 months going into 2026. Third, I don't see anything in the coming...
Why do you think you could even end in 8? I mean, that seems optimistic.
Well, the reason is straightforward, because as an analyst, I am loath to make predictions in a conventional war beyond 6 months, and even saying that it's going to go on at least for 12, I think is putting myself out there. But so the answer is it's at least probably this amount of time, Ryan, and that's as far out as I'm willing to see, conceding that I can't even see it 6 months out. But because all sorts of things, like I said, things are pretty contingent. So, you're trying to...
Your favorite word.
It is my favorite word. But
copyright.
Yeah, it is. It's my favorite word for good reason. But the point I was about to make was that there's nothing in the coming few months that I can see that would force Russian political leadership to decide whether or not they are or not going to continue war. Not from an economic or military standpoint. All of these constraints are not constraints that force Russia to a decision point in the coming few weeks or few months. And so I do worry there's a little bit of an overcorrection to take us from, we are back, which I think is a correct and good attitude, to, okay, everything has changed now in the military balance and the political balance, and things are really looking up. Probably because I'm kind of conservative as an analyst, I am reticent to go that far. And it's not the sense I get from Ukrainian colleagues in Ukraine.
And I think also there's a seasonal aspect to what we're about to see on the end. Also, there's a pattern of when things are stalling for Russia on the ground and they're not where they want to be. It's the winter months. The ground conditions are terrible. We start to see them lash out with increased drone strikes and missile strikes on Ukraine, and they're already at a very high level. They've been at their record levels all year long. So I think that without, quote, good news to sell to the Russian population on the ground, I think we're going to start to see more months of retaliatory strikes on Ukrainian civilian targets too.
Can I just add, very briefly, there's also some extent there, I feel a sense suddenly in Western discourse, particularly European discourse, that maybe Russia's doing all these things in European countries because they suddenly feel like the balance has shifted and they're losing the war. And I see nothing in Russian discourse that leads me to believe that they think they're losing the war or that something has changed. There's absolutely no willingness to change in terms of their demands. And it's not necessarily helpful to gaslight yourself into believing that something else is going other than it is. I do think probably a lot of the airspace violations have to do with Russian concern over Ukraine's strike campaign in Russia, believing that we and European allies are behind it, and getting increasingly nervous and maybe trying to signal to them that there could be consequences for European infrastructure as well if it unfolds. But that is pure speculation on my part. What I definitely don't see is a big narrative shift or discourse shift in Russia, except a visible recognition by them that they're not doing nearly as well on the battlefield as they had hoped or expected this year. And I think that is something that we objectively all agree on. But we have to be careful not to overly torque that story into the other direction.
I guess what it concerns and encourages depends whether we're talking Ukraine or Russia. A collapse can happen quickly and unexpectedly. Perhaps the most classic example is Imperial Russia in 1917. No one really saw that coming. And this could happen on either the Russian side or the Ukrainian side, and often whether it's political, military, economic, or a combination of the thing in ways that people don't expect. And both of these countries are under severe strain. Ukraine's biggest problems beyond energy are an undermanned force, low confidence in the government strategy to actually win the war, in terms of revealed preferences of people volunteering for the infantry at least. And in Russia, of course, you have this dire economic situation and a totalitarian regime that suppresses the signals that we might otherwise be seeing in other countries that something is actually deeply problematic and about to break. So things can change quite quickly in ways that we don't expect. And maybe they won't, but I just think it's important to consider the possibility.
Well, a lot of the things that contribute to that, let me just tackle it from the Russian side, and Mike can hop in from the Ukrainians. The Russian soldiers are still being paid. They're still getting their benefits by and large. The things that keep them where they are, they're compelled to stay in place, of course. They're not free to leave. They are not free to resign their contract, any of those things. But a lot of the things that contribute to resilience and staying and fighting are still present within the force. So there's not a political collapse in Russia. The finances are bad, but they are not collapse bad. I'm sorry, my brain is not functioning, but they're not at that point on their side. There is a general feeling that I have noticed increasingly articulated in Russian military circles and defense circles in terms of opening up critique ever so slightly over time in the last maybe year and a half, where people are starting to ask the questions in pretty military scientific terms, or not lay people terms, but they're asking it openly of, the way this war is being fought is really outpacing our force structure. It's outpacing our understanding of operational art and science. We really need a regroup, after this is all done. There's this. That's a very Russian way of saying we're kind of running out of ideas for how to crack this nut. We have a way that we think we can hammer at it on the ground. We have a way that we think we could hammer at political will with what we're doing every night against Ukraine in terms of strikes. But there's a recognition that this isn't going to cut it. It's not going to get them what they want. But they can't off-ramp. None of them are in the position to off-ramp. That decision only comes from the Kremlin. And I don't see any impetus to off-ramp at this point. The status that this is at is fine for the Kremlin as long as people are still walking through the door to sign up. Now, there's some signs that maybe that's slowing down a little bit, but not catastrophically for the Russians.
Yeah. So, Brian, I appreciate that you two are a fan of contingency, since you introduced this prospect that all sorts of things could happen. And we did see, for example, in the Prigozhin mutiny, this kind of case already playing out, although a lot of people hope to be more than what it was. And these events, by their nature, are very difficult to predict. But, as an honest, I never base kind of my thinking about the war on the fact this might happen. It kind of almost reminds me, whenever I think about it, it reminds me of kind of an old Gary Larson cartoon where a physicist is writing this long mathematical formula and then puts an arrow at one point of it and says, and then a miracle happens, And so, we can't base strategy on this. Although regularly I do see kind of writings and op-eds to the effect of, if we just keep going, we can just hope that Russia has an economic heart attack or some internal political instability. And the same thing, Russians clearly hope that Ukraine will have some kind of collapse of the front line, or something else will happen in terms of Western support for Ukraine. Well, I think we can say honestly now is that the way Russian military is fighting is not conducive to attaining any operationally significant breakthroughs. That's fair. I think that, therefore, we're not likely to see these types of collapses, right? However, wars are fundamentally unstable systems. There are gradual and sudden effects. And you can see them occasionally at the tactical level. The breach, or if you call it maybe minor breakthrough, Dobropilye, that happened in July, was a symptom of a larger problem that I and many other analysts in Ukraine, outside of Ukraine, have been discussing for some time. Fortunately, it was more of a one-time case or episode, but nonetheless, there are these sort of unexpected events that do play out over the course of a war.
Let's talk about the Tomahawks. President Trump announced that he wants to give Tomahawks to Ukraine, and he wants allies to offer similar systems as well, and that apparently we're going to be providing intelligence for use of deep strike as well. That was leaked, not in Trump's announcement. What do you make of this? Is this important? Is this wise, unwise, problematic, amazing, somewhere in between?
So I think we've always wanted Ukraine to have, I'm speaking for myself, I can speak for you too, Mike, if you want, but it's always been a good idea to let Ukraine have deep strike capabilities just operationally. Okay, yeah, yes, give them deep strike, but there's a few issues with Tomahawk, and I'm very curious on how the conversation jumped from HIMARS to Tomahawk and not other systems that we might have like JASSMs. Tomahawks, I think most of the listeners are familiar with it, but just in case you're not, they are fired typically in our force from surface ships and submarines, the Mk-41 launcher. If you've ever seen it outside of a ship, it is larger than a semi-truck. It is huge. The United States has tried to create a ground-launched version of this in the Typhoon system. We have very few of them. A couple batteries, I think. We're expected to have 4 batteries by a couple years from now. Very limited ability to do ground launch. And even with the system that we have, there's been some concerns that it's too large, it's not mobile enough, and it won't survive long if we're in a conflict with a near peer. There are issues that I don't have answers to on how Ukraine would launch Tomahawks. Do they have something that's indigenous that can take one of these systems and launch it like the Frankensam program? That took a few years to happen, but it works. Frankensam works as a program. This is when we take Western systems and put them in Soviet launchers and do some, creative engineering, and then they work. But again, I don't see where in the near term Ukraine could actually ingest Tomahawk missiles and launch them unless there's some secret plan that I don't know about, and I acknowledge that that's a possibility. It makes more sense to me as a long-range plan. Maybe a couple of years from now, we agree now that they're going to have them, and then some solution is magically found, and then they can launch them. But right now,
kind of like the F-16. It makes more sense over the long term.
And this is a Ukrainian strategy to ask for things, ask enough times, and eventually the Americans will say yes, and then you'll get it in a few years. But I don't see that this makes a lot of sense. How's it going to be launched? That's my top question.
Yeah, technically it's challenging because if we look at the Typhoon system, it's about 4 launch cells per vehicle. The vehicles are very large, and we probably are still going to have a very small salvo rate. That's the number of missiles you can fire in any one salvo. The Tomahawk is, through all its iterations, still one of the oldest cruise missiles that's deployed, and it's quite interceptable as well.
And not cheap.
It's not cheap. The system's not cheap. It's not easily at all redeployable. If it's something like we're going to strap it to some Ukrainian rail launcher, well, the Frankensam that you allude to took about a year to make work. Okay, so this, I don't know if this will take more time, less time, but just saying it's not necessarily that easy. All right, let's say we do this capability, provide this capability. What is the objective? To me, it's very clear that how we ended up here is that the Trump administration had issued multiple ultimatums regarding sanctions and tariffs, and then eventually conveyed, by virtue of not following through on any of them, that actually these are essentially bluffs. And now they are once again frustrated with a lack of progress to end the war and are seeking to compel Russia with the threat of some kind of Tomahawk deployment that Trump said he sort of made in principle, but then it's not clear on the details because in his statement he mentioned he's not sure how Ukraine is going to use them. I'm not sure what that means because I think it's pretty obvious how Ukraine would intend to use them. But nonetheless, it feels like it's another course of effort, and the question remains, first, how will Russians react to it? Will they take it very seriously or not? Is it going to have any kind of significant impact on them? And second, all these military technical questions that Dara raised and that I've raised as well that I'm not as sure about. But let's see. Maybe whether or not you think it's a bluff. Okay, what I will say is that I think sometimes we end up in a place where even if it starts out as a bluff, you then have to end up making it real. And I suspect that one way or another, we may end up having to make this real in Ukraine. I'm just not sure what effect it will make.
My concern on the U.S. strategy to providing advanced capabilities to the Ukrainians is that we provide it, I think, as a result of either the logistics of how we get it there or our own inventory problems. We provide things in very small numbers, which gives the Russians a chance to adapt to it and to understand it and adapt to it. So just think of it like, I like to use this analogy. It's not the best one, but I think it helps. If you have strep throat and they give you antibiotics and you take 2 days of it, you're like, I feel better. I'm going to stop taking my antibiotics right now. You're going to grow some kind of super strep version that has been damaged a little bit, but then has time to grow and become worse. I worry that if we give small numbers, just like we did with
Russia
HIMARS,
adapts.
GIMLRS,
Yeah.
they adapt. They come up with they have a month or two where they take a few really hard hits, and then they come up with a technical solution. And if we do that with Tomahawk, which is the backbone of our naval precision strike, it's an old missile. We introduce it. Here's your 8 Tomahawk missiles. The Russians will, that'll probably be problematic the first time, and then they'll come up with a solution.
It doesn't change the balance of the war.
It doesn't change the balance of the war. And just to run this math for folks, if you go back in time to a public example, when the United States hit a facility in Syria, we hit a regional airbase in Syria. We fired 60 Tomahawks at it, 60 Tomahawks at that airbase, and it didn't damage it. I mean, it destroyed it for a couple of days, and then the Syrians, came up with a solution. If we're giving the Ukrainians a small number of Tomahawks,
unless they hit the Kremlin, this won't really matter.
Unless they hit the Kremlin. I mean, a Tomahawk we use it as for damaging a radar or damaging a part of a building. I mean, that's how we use it. It takes a ton to generate military effects. I don't see how we will give them an operationally relevant number with all the conversation that we are having about our own PGM stockpiles. How do those things live together without tension with the Pentagon?
We have a episode. I just recorded it right before you guys got here, actually. It's not going to come out until after this episode, but it was with 3 companies. It's for our Cogs of War show on defense tech and defense industry, with 3 companies working to produce missiles at lower cost. 2 of them, Mach and Anduril, working to produce much cheaper cruise missiles, and the other Castilian hypersonics, but really interesting conversation. So that's just the plug for the listeners to listen to that, which will be coming out on Cogs of War on our next episode.
Ryan, I was going to say, the missile that made a lot more sense, I can't remember, is it Esrim or Razum, the air-launched, much cheaper cruise missile and standoff missile. I think those capabilities, personally, in terms of ability to mass produce and employ in larger salvo size, made a lot more sense. Maybe that came up in your podcast as well.
So I do think there's a lot, it won't surprise either of you, I do not like about the administration's Ukraine policy. But the most, as we're here in the last quarter of 2025, the most important development in the war has been the Trump administration's policy on Ukraine did not end up nearly as bad as it could have been, as we all worried, right? It's not as good as it could be, but we were all worried that he would abandon Ukraine, Ukraine would collapse, or be left as sort of a rump state of some sort. And so far, at least, who knows what the next Truth Social post holds, but we've avoided the worst. And that's despite this disastrous Oval Office meeting at the beginning of the year. There was a lot of diplomacy and by Europeans, by Washington, by Kyiv, and repaired these relationships. And it just shows a lot of interests are baked in, even when you have a president who's, as let's just say, unconventional as this one. But I do think that's been the most important development of 2025. Again, policy could be a lot better, but it certainly could have become a lot worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very far from the worst case scenario. It's actually overall a lot more positive. Now, I mean, the one thing the administration didn't do was take any means to really compel Russia. That's true, but that could be an offing for 2026. And I think that Europeans also feel they avoided the worst case scenario and have tried to maintain the kind of status quo in terms of U.S. commitment to NATO. But the only things that are kind of out there still issues to drop, and this is not about the Russia-Ukraine war, but it does affect this conversation, is what happens in the NDS, and more importantly, the force posture review. Okay, which is what does this administration decide? regarding the future presence of U.S. forces and capabilities in Europe. And that's still kind of out there in the ether, right? But it's coming. And we eventually will see the results of those deliberations, and they will affect both the transatlantic relationship and also will have some impact on how we are perceived as playing a leading role in helping to manage European security.
And I think a lot of us, when we started seeing some of the signaling that was going on in the early months of the Trump administration, when they were interested in bringing the war to a close, we watched carefully the Russian reactions. And we saw the same old business as usual coming out of the Kremlin and coming out of the key players over there. And we would have conversations like, okay, they're going to send in Lavrov and he's going to give an 800-year history of the Muscovy and Genghis Khan and all of this, and as a joke, because we knew exactly that's what would happen. He's going to waste everybody's time. Putin's going to do the same thing. They're just going to be themselves, and that's exactly what the Russians did. They're very consistent. They I think squandered probably a really good opportunity with this administration in the early months by being completely inflexible, by giving everybody a history lesson, by not picking up the signals that the administration was putting down. And so, there was that churn with Zelensky and that whole business I think is behind us. But I do think the Russians have continued to misplay their hand, and the administration is now annoyed with them, and they rightfully should be annoyed with them because they're not serious.
Putin's only path to real victory was getting Trump on his side or to get Trump to stand aside. That was his theory of victory, and that has not come to pass. And
because they cannot get out of their own way on this, and I think this is really important to remember, is that Vladimir Putin's hatred for the position of the president of the United States, I'm not talking about its personal occupant, but like the job itself. The institution of the presidency of the United States, the contempt that he holds for the United States, the contempt that he holds for CIA or any number of other Cold War foes, they are fundamental to who he is as a person. And even when it's in his best interests and in his state's best interests to try to swallow some of that and put it aside to make some kind of deal, can't do it. He can't do it. And we've seen that play out all year long. I don't see that changing. But as Mike's saying, I don't see the compellence on our end.
Yeah, that's what's missing. Dara, you have a fascinating new article out in Foreign Affairs, and I'd like to talk about the argument that you make specifically as it pertains to the future. So you're arguing not just about Russian military as a learning organization in the present, but what happens after the war, what will remain a part of the Russian armed forces and inform how they fight the next war, which we hope doesn't happen, but might be with NATO, including, of course, our country.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. So I wrote this piece. It's based on some research that we'll be pushing out soon on Carnegie banner. But I wanted to tackle the question, moving beyond the scholarship that's already been done on Russian adaptation in Ukraine on the front lines, and there's been a ton written on that. This takes it a step further to explore an area that hasn't really been focused on, in my view, which is this whole environment of learning. It's really the tip of the iceberg is what we are seeing in Ukraine. But there's all this activity going on inside Russia to make that combat experience permanent, to make sure that they don't lose it, and so that they can take it on board and become potentially a more competent organization after this is all said and done. And when an organization is showing signs of learning, specifically a military, it has to create mechanisms to get that combat experience and to analyze it and to come up with proposals and solutions, send out information to the troops, and make sure that guidance is being implemented. So we can track things in Ukraine. We see Russian units start to do something, and then all of a sudden we see it proliferate across the front line. But I think what has not been tracked is to the extent that it goes into a system inside Russia and Moscow, and then all of a sudden it's being trained to all the new officers, the new conscripts are being trained on the idea. They have organized their research and development base to support the war. I think 70% of what the military research institutions in Russia are doing are supporting operational problems. The procurement base has been tied in closely with what's happening on the war. And it's just been really interesting for me to see this bottom-up approach to learning. So interviews with soldiers on the front line, and it gets ingested into a system through reports, interviews, direct observation, and it gets carried back to Russia. And at senior levels, they think about it, they analyze it, they come up with solutions to problems, and then they share it. Like, hey, defense base, everyone's complaining about scopes. Why do they have to physically leave their tank to go change their scope from a day to night scope? And then they get shot. Like, why did you do this? Fix it. And then they fix it. Those are minor adaptation issues. But there's also bigger structural things going on that I think are interesting, not only for the equipment, but thinking about how to train people, thinking about how to command them, thinking about the structure in the future. And I just there's so much activity going on, and this article was an attempt to start talking about that.
We'll definitely recommend it. Mike, you told me you hated the article. Do you want to talk about why?
Yes, Ryan, because it didn't have my name on it.
Oh, okay. No, but seriously, what do you think? This is something you track as well. What are your thoughts? What are you seeing in terms of how Russia's incorporating these bigger lessons?
I think it's a great piece that's part of a wider and much more in-depth piece of research that Dara did, and I just want to commend her because I thought it was I thought it was a great piece to put out and to have a conversation beyond the war about Russian military learning. I hope more people will engage with it because we're consistently, just as an answer, trying to have three conversations at the same time. One is on what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war, which we focus on here. Another one is on the future Russian military constitution, and what that challenge looks like for us looking 5, 7, 10 years out. And the third one is on lessons learned from this war for our own militaries. What are we seeing in terms of technology development, tactics, changes in force structure and organizational capacity? So, and I think while I'll spend a lot of time day to day talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, Dara and I spend a whole chunk of our year actually trying to do more long-term research, looking out to what the future Russian military looks like and what the lessons might be. And so this work, and I'm working on something as well, looking at future Russian force design, which hopefully I'll have the opportunity to talk more about with folks in the future, are the kind of things we've been working on in 2025.
Great. This is a great conversation. Really appreciate you both joining. Thanks for listening to the War on the Rocks podcast. Please don't forget to check out our membership program, where among other things, you can listen to more of Mike and his pals on the Russia contingency. Sign up at warontherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.